Died August 1931. Buried November 1931. A victim of the elements.
Despite their hostility to man, the burning heat, the sparseness of vegetation, the lack of water, deserts exert a strange fascination. Prospectors drawn here to Death Valley by the lure of gold and mineral wealth have left a legacy of place names that paint a vivid picture of this notorious environment. Such parched wildernesses may seem remote. Man does not readily choose to live under such conditions. Yet hot deserts are one of our planet's most important features, occupying almost a fifth of the entire land surface. But the popular conception of a desert as endless tracts of sand is only one aspect of a much more complex environment in which heat, wind and water play crucial roles.
It's difficult to believe that we're in the middle of Death Valley, but just outside this leafy oasis is one of the most forbidding parts of our planet. In the summer, the temperature may climb as high as 134 degrees Fahrenheit, while on the ground, the temperature may go within 10 degrees of boiling water. But here, there is water. It's irrigated, and so the desert blooms. Now, there's no precise definition of a desert, though clearly the water is critical. It's not so much the amount of rainfall, though that's usually very low, but it's the imbalance between the rainfall and the rates of evaporation. In Death Valley, the 12-foot deep lake would disappear in less than a year.
While most of the world's major deserts lie within belts of prevailing dry winds, deserts are formed by a combination of factors. Death Valley is a part of a wider arid region of the southwestern USA, where the deserts largely owe their existence to the rain shadow caused by the region's mountains. On Death Valley's western flank towers the Panamint Range. Any water carried by the prevailing winds from the west tends to fall there and rarely on the sweltering valley floor. Even though Death Valley is not typical of the world's great deserts, in this limited area we can observe all the important desert processes and so judge which will leave their mark in the sedimentary record. For it's by studying the sedimentary record that we can find evidence that deserts have been a feature of this planet far back into the geological past. A variety of sediments are formed in deserts, and the starting point is the weathering and erosion of the mountains. Disintegration of the bedrock produces scree slopes mantling the mountain sides. Different rock types weather in different ways, and there are a wide range of rock types in the mountains surrounding Death Valley, and consequently a wide variety of weathering styles. These spectacularly shattered boulders were weathered by a process common in arid areas, salt shattering. Salts within the rocks dissolve in water from dew and the limited rainfall. Then, with the enormous rates of evaporation, crystals grow and with their expansion split the rocks apart. There's only one agent to transport this coarse weathered debris: water. Though rain may be rare in a desert, when it does come, it's usually torrential, and with so little vegetation to hold it back, water runoff is rapid, funneling into canyons to produce flash floods.
During a flash flood, the rapidly moving current transports a good deal of material. Some of it has been deposited in this sharp corner of the canyon here. The strength of the current is apparent both from the amount of material and also the size of boulders, such as this one here. It's really quite a size. Now, although the canyon is bone dry at the moment, having seen deposits like this piled up right up here, it's very easy indeed to imagine the water current boiling and churning its way off down through the canyon.
Most of the debris is carried out through the canyon and dumped at the mountain's edge in a conical accumulation of poorly sorted sediment known as an alluvial fan. Some of these fans are gigantic, up to 6 miles long and over 1,000 feet high. They're formed because once the raging floodwaters are released from the confines of the canyon, they spread out, losing depth and velocity, and so can no longer transport the coarser sediment. Broad flood channels run down the fan. Over time, they migrate, depositing sediment over the entire fan. But this is a slow process, and the darker areas of the fan mark parts which have remained undisturbed for many years. These channels are broad and flat, and their floors are covered with a characteristic network of smaller channels formed by braided streams. The braided network consists of short channels and intervening bars. As the sediment-laden floodwater sweeps down the slope, so there's repeated clogging of these channels. As one channel clogs, the stream migrates to cut new channels that repeatedly divide and meet about the low bars. And it's the migration of these braided stream networks that's responsible for the fan's detailed structure.
This channel wall shows the structure of the alluvial fan. The sediment is very poorly sorted indeed. There's sand and silt, there are cobbles, there are even some boulders. Overall, water deposition has produced a crude lenticular stratification. Some of the beds are quite fine, but others are much coarser. This variation in the sediment size is a reflection of variation in the strength of the water currents.
An alluvial fan may be constructed from a spectrum of events, both water-lane deposits as well as poorly sorted flows of muddy debris. Continued subsidence of Death Valley's floor has allowed thousands of feet of alluvial fan sediments to accumulate. These enormous fans first started to form thousands of years ago, but present rainfall is inadequate to explain their size, and the bulk of the fans was evidently formed in somewhat wetter conditions. On at least the smaller fans, water will flow across the toe of the fan and out onto the flat valley floor, known as a playa, to form a temporary lake. Since water at the base of the fan flows gently, it can only transport the finest sediments, so the playa sediment is composed of fine silts and clays. As the playa dries out in the intense heat, desiccation cracks form. In other areas, the water flowing onto the valley floor contains high concentrations of dissolved salts. With evaporation, these crystallize, forming white blooms. Death Valley's floor forms one of the world's largest salt pans. But although salt is still forming, the overall thickness is too great to be explained by the present-day processes. It's a relic of a huge salty lake that existed some 2,000 years ago. As the ancient lake evaporated, the least soluble salts accumulated on the edges and floor, and finally, the most soluble salt, sodium chloride, crystallized in the center. Recrystallization has subsequently contorted the surface into incredible shapes. For all its scarcity, water is of major importance in shaping the arid environment of Death Valley. That's clear from the creation of alluvial fans, the accumulation of evaporites and deposition within the playa. But there's another vital agent, wind. This dust storm in the Sahara shows how fine sediment can be blown hundreds of feet into the air and transported on the wind for many miles. But in aeolian transport, the bulk of the sand-sized sediment is carried in a thick carpet just above the surface. While the finer sediments may be carried in suspension by the wind, most of the sand-sized grains move in a series of small leaps and bounds known as saltation. Some larger grains are moved by continual bombardment with smaller grains in a process called creep. But none of these processes is capable of moving large grains, so wind-blown sands consist of a much narrower range of grain sizes than water-lain sediments. As in water, wind-blown sands form ripples which migrate downwind as sand is stripped off the windward slope and redeposited on the lee slope. In Death Valley, sand is stripped from parts of the valley floor. Eventually, this wind-blown sand collects to form a dune field. To identify sandstones formed in ancient deserts, we need to study modern dunes to determine the features of wind-blown sands that are likely to be preserved in the sedimentary record. Dunes are not static features. Like ripples, they migrate with the wind. But this dune field is not steadily migrating down Death Valley. Rather, through the year, variable winds move the dunes this way and that, so that overall the dune field remains in the same area. Dunes migrate slowly, and their shapes reflect long-term wind directions. Since there are prevailing winds in Death Valley for parts of the year, we can observe the process of dune migration and see what type of structures are formed. A dune migrates by wind stripping sand off its windward side, and as the sand-laden air flows over the crest, so sand falls out of suspension to form grainfall deposits on the lee slope. This movement of sand and wind over the dune produces a gentle windward slope and a lee slope consisting of a steep upper section and a gentler basal apron. The continued accumulation of sand as the dune migrates is not a simple process, and several distinct processes operate, giving the dune internal structure. Grainfall deposits accumulate on the upper part of the lee slope, and sooner or later they become unstable. Each avalanche produces a tongue-shaped deposit of sand, tapering at the edges but with little internal structure. Avalanches only affect the upper section of the lee slope, the slip face. They do not extend right to the bottom of the lee slope, and the basal apron remains undisturbed. A series of avalanches down the slip face produces cross-bedding. This is picked out by small variations in grain size and colour at the interface between successive avalanche deposits. Occasionally, you can see this cross-bedded structure where the remains of an old dune have been exposed by the wind. However, structures will only be preserved when there is net accumulation of sand, so that dunes are buried by the migration of subsequent dunes. But it is very rare for a dune to be buried complete. Usually, erosion on the windward slope removes the upper part of the structure, leaving a sequence of cross-bedded strata, each representing maybe as little as a quarter of the original crest height of the dune. Ripples on the windward slope are unlikely to be preserved, and on the upper parts of the lee slopes they'll also be destroyed by avalanching. Beneath this area, on the basal apron, ripples are formed by eddy currents blowing across the lee slope or even back up the lee slope in the opposite direction to the prevailing wind that moves the dune. What sort of structures will these ripples leave? If there is net deposition of sediment, a ripple will climb over the deposit left by the previous ripples, only reworking part of it. Consequently, the migration of a sequence of ripples will leave behind a deposit with distinctive fine laminations, each lamination being the deposit left by the migration of a single ripple. Because wind-blown sands are well sorted, cross-laminations are rarely picked out by grain size variations. The action of wind in forming ripples differs from that of water in that fine material tends to be scoured from the crest of the ripple. This results in the grading of grains in a wind-formed ripple structure being fine at the base and coarse at the top. This inverse grading is preserved in aeolian ripple laminations and is exactly the opposite of what occurs in water-formed laminations. So, on the lee slope of a dune, the area where structures are most likely to be preserved, we have ripple laminations formed on the basal apron and avalanche structures on the slip face, giving dune cross-bedding. There are also flatter interdune areas, similar to the player deposit, consisting mostly of silts. After heavy rainfall, they dry, forming polygonal cracks which are then infilled with blown sand. So interdune deposits are a third type of structure which may be preserved in the rock record. Despite the hostile environment, the dunes are far from lifeless. So in amongst the dunes, animal tracks, burrows and even plant roots may also be preserved. In Death Valley, we've seen a wide variety of modern desert processes and determined a number of features which might be preserved in the geological record. But can we recognize them in ancient deposits, and which are most likely to be preserved? In fact, most deposits of ancient deserts are sandstones, so we'll concentrate on these. Sand dunes are preserved because they tend to form in areas of continuing subsidence, thus allowing the accumulation of great thicknesses of sandstone. This is Zion National Park in Utah, and these spectacular cliffs are made from one of the most famous ancient desert sandstones, the Jurassic Navajo sandstone. The dune cross-bedding is magnificently exposed and occurs on a huge scale. Some of these sandstone cliffs are over 1,000 feet high. As we've seen, dunes are rarely buried complete. The upper portions are shaved off by erosion, and each set of cross beds represents the accumulated leeward deposits of a single dune. These two bed forms, each some 50 feet thick, represent the passage of two dunes, each of which may originally have been more than 200 feet high. Such large-scale cross-bedding was generally thought to be diagnostic of wind-formed dunes, but recent surveys have revealed submarine structures of comparable size, so we need to find specific evidence that these sandstones really were deposited in a desert.
As we saw in Death Valley, dunes are produced by a variety of processes. If these sediments are aeolian, then they should also show evidence for wind deposition. This bed behind me marks the passage of a single dune. Near the top, the cross strata are thick. But towards the base, they taper to a wedge. What sort of sedimentary processes are responsible for this structure? Over there, the bed is cut more or less parallel to the direction of movement of the dune. And here is the same bed at right angles. That's transverse to the dune's advance. And there are also wedge-shaped structures. So here we have wedge-shaped structures that taper transversely across the dune, and in the same bed taper towards the base of the dune. They are avalanche structures formed by sand cascading down the lee slope of this dune. And of course this process results in the avalanche deposits having little internal structure. The bases of these avalanches intertongue with a much finer stratification. These beds were formed by ripples moving across the basal apron. In fact, these ripple-produced laminations are found throughout the Navajo sandstone.
Such fine, uniform laminations occurring on such a wide scale are often of themselves regarded as very good evidence of aeolian deposition. To back this conclusion, we need detailed evidence of their internal structure. This is best seen in areas such as this stream bed, where the sandstone is freshly eroded. In amongst the fine laminations, the occasional cross-lamination not only gives the direction of migration, but also defines the top and bottom of the lamination. So we can determine that it's the base that's fine-grained, grading upwards to coarser grain size. It's inversely graded, another good indication of aeolian deposition. Other lines of evidence also support a desert origin for the Navajo sandstone. This reddish bed, sandwiched between cross-bedded sandstones, isn't very thick, and it doesn't stretch very far. It's composed of silt. It's an ancient interdune deposit, and where we see the top surface exposed, there are the diagnostic polygonal mud cracks infilled with coarser, wind-blown sand.
All in all, the evidence that the Navajo sandstone is a wind-blown deposit is overwhelming. We've seen superb dune bedding. We've also seen interdune deposits. But in reconstructing the paleo-environment of the Navajo sandstone, it is necessary to use many lines of evidence. For instance, the texture and the size of the grains, the presence of fossils, dinosaur tracks, and even the occasional dinosaur. It's this combination of evidence together which is used to show that the Navajo sandstone must have been a Jurassic desert.